In this tutorial, we're going to be talking about how to make a pocket like this with a piped edge. Okay, so I've made myself a pattern, just got a shape on the half and put a facing on. I've cut the pocket out of some warp and weft cloth. I'm working on the straight of the grain here, and I've applied a non-woven fusible to the other side to give it some stability. I've cut a section of bias from a piece of lining that I had, and it's wide enough to take on a much thicker cord than I'm using, which in this case is a 3mm cotton cord. So the first thing to do is to take your piping cord and to sandwich it in your strip, and to get the piping cord as close to the folded edge as possible. And to help you control this, you can use a set of pins just to get it lined as you go, and estimate how much you're going to need to go around your pocket. Cut a little bit more, because as you go around curves, you're going to have to ease in just a little bit more. You also want to make sure that you have enough to go through your facing at the top of the pocket. So once this is set up, you can give yourself a little bit more of a stable situation before you start sewing by putting in some tacking stitches. And this is good because the pins might get in the way as you're sewing, so you can set it up with a bit of basting cotton, and then you can take out your pins. Okay, so now I'm going to cut a length, and I'm going to show you how to apply it to half of the edge of this pocket. So now we have our piping cord encased in this piece of lining. It's all set up and it's ready to sew. Now the folded edge of this, which encases the cord, is on the left side of my piece of lining strip here. You can see that the foot I'm using, the foot is positioned to the right of the needle. So the piping cord is to the left, the foot is to the right of the needle. And depending how you want to maneuver your work, you can get a foot which is set up in the opposite way. Okay? So this foot has the presser foot here to the left of the needle. Okay? So you need both really, depending on what kind of job you're doing. So now we're going to set this up and we're going to begin to sew. Now I'm using a longer stitch. I'm at about 3.5 on my industrial machine. In order to keep your work nice and even and consistent, you might want to give a little bit of a pull with your right hand with these fingers here. Okay? Just to make sure the needle is as close to the piping cord as possible. And as you go along, now we don't have our tacking thread, we don't have our pins, but you could just control this with your hands. Pretend your nails here are your pins. And just keep going. And let's have a look at what we've done so far. You can see what we've got here. We've got our 3mm piping cord nicely sandwiched in, and then you can see that that is going to be trimmed and put on the edge of the pocket. So I'll finish this section and then we'll apply it to the pocket. So now I've completed the section of piping to finish off this pocket. One thing to consider is your seam allowance. I've allowed 1 centimeter seam allowance. So that means 1 centimeter from my stitching line here to the edge of the folded fabric. Here's how I like to set that up. I take a centimeter guide. Now I'm using my pattern master and a sharp piece of chalk to mark the seam allowance in. You can also use a tape measure to mark your centimeter, or you can use a steel hemming guide. Whatever works best. But now I'm going to trim this so that when I sew it, the centimeter is going to be on the edge of the fabric and my seam allowance will be following this line of stitching. So my piping strip is now all prepared with a centimeter seam allowance, and I'm going to show you how I apply this to just half of the pocket. So give yourself a little bit of lead room up at the top here. Position your needle as close to that stitching line as you can. And you can also, just to give yourself a little bit of security as you're sewing this around, set things up with a pin every now and then. Now we're sewing on the straight now, so you don't need to add any additional ease. You can see that I'm not exactly pushing the piping in, but I'm just encouraging the needle to get as close to that line of stitching as possible. And this is where the hands do come in handy. Don't run over any pins. Now we're on the straight, so we don't have to make too many accommodations, but as we get to the curve, we're going to have to set this up with a little bit of ease, not too much, because then the cord, the piping end will come out a little bit thicker. You can see what's happening as I put some ease in. You can see what's happening. The casing around the piping is starting to expand because it's on the bias. So it's becoming bigger. And if you don't stay close to the edge, then you're going to get a wider piping as you go around the curve. Now this takes nothing more than practice. And I've given us quite a sharp curve here, which is challenging. But I'll show you how you can use your pins and your hands and just go slow and use this, your left hand, to kind of control the needle. Walk the needle if you have to. Go slowly and work ahead. See where we're heading here. Staying very close to the piping edge. When you get, and you can see what's happening, if you get a little bit too close, what happens is the needle might catch onto the cord itself, and you don't want that to happen. But the thing you do want is you want to maintain an even curve. And if you don't, you're going to get sections that break and look angular. So now when this is done, if you're not happy, you can always give it another pass. You know, that is allowed. But you can kind of check your work and see how it's coming along. Now this looks okay, but you can see something's gone a little bit wonky just here, and I think I've just caught in the piping cord. But that's just something for you to work on and try. Now, before we go to pressing this, I'm going to say that you need to clip this. Now, I'm not going to clip too close now. This is just to show you the next step. Because when you get to the iron, it's going to be a lot easier to fold these in succession. Okay? So there we are. So now we're going to go over to the press board and we're going to show you the finished pocket. So now you can see our finished pocket in the reverse side and how I've pressed it after I've clipped close to that stitching, and I've pressed it around the curve, and I've allowed each segment that I've cut into to overlap slightly on both sides. This side I've gone that way, this side I've gone that way, but what it does is it gives a really nice flat finish. There's your pocket. You can give it a final press, use a cloth, and there we are. So this is an example of how to use a piping cord, but there's another thing you can do to get some contrast and some embellishment, and that is by installing a flat piping. Now it just so happens that I'm relining a jacket, and there was already piping installed, but I've taken it off, I've given it a good press, and I've restitched it on. So this jacket came with a flat piping contrast, but you can add it to your bespoke garments by making your own flat piping, and it's the same thing as we prepared for our corded piping, by cutting a strip of bias and folding it in half and giving it a press. So you can prepare your own, and then as I was working on this jacket, of course I removed the old lining. I made sure I had the care label intact. I set up some notches here and there so that when I put this back together, I can control the ease that was originally in the lining. And then I will then go on to cut my new lining pieces. To install your lining with this contrast piping, you would just prepare your new piece of lining, put your raw edges together, and you can set this up with a set of pins, or you can tack, you can baste it with a machine. But what I want to show you here is how much control you have over the amount of contrast that you end up with. So the lining pieces is set up, your flat piping is in place, and now you can determine with your seam allowance just how much contrast you want. And what you do want in your finished project is that you have a consistent width of your flat piping. So this is why I took the piping off, I pressed it flat, and then I trimmed it so that it was exactly a 1/2 inch or 5/8 of an inch or whatever. And then when you put in your lining piece, if you want a little bit less contrast to show, you can just take a bigger seam allowance. See, and then you've got less. So there you are. There's a few examples of what you can do with your piping. Add a contrast, or that's outside, or something on the inside, using a corded piping or a flat piping. And by the way, when you're going to stitch this pocket on, you can use this ditch, which is right in the middle, where the piping stitching line is, and you can use that to sew your pocket on. So you would then be putting your pocket on invisibly, just like that.